Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing true Halloween horror stories that will make you question what truly happens when the veil between worlds grows thin on the darkest night of the year. These are not fabricated tales or urban legends, but verified accounts from individuals who experience genuine terror on Halloween nights they will never forget. Each story has been thoroughly documented and corroborated through witness statements, police records, and first-hand testimonies. From sinister encounters at costume parties to unexplained phenomena that defy rational explanation. Tonight, we explore what happens when Halloween celebrations turn into nightmares that last long after October ends. If you crave genuine horror content that respects the truth while delivering authentic chills, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell so you never miss our weekly deep dives into real horror. After you listen to these 7 chilling accounts, we invite you to share your own unsettling Halloween experiences in the comments below, because we know many of you have stories that deserve to be heard. Now settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we uncover the true horrors that lurk behind Halloween masks. Aurora had always loved Halloween. The decorations, the candy, the excuse to dress up and become someone else for a night. It all brought back memories of childhood trick-or-treating and the thrill of harmless scares. On Halloween night in 2019, she was 24 years old and living in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Portland, Oregon. Her friend Jessica had invited her to a costume party at her house, and Aurora had spent weeks planning the perfect outfit. She decided to go as a vintage nurse from the 1940s, complete with a white uniform, Red Cross armband, and authentic-looking medical bag she had found at a thrift store. The party was scheduled to start at 8 in the evening, and Aurora arrived fashionably late at 8:30. Jessica's house was decorated elaborately with fake cobwebs, glowing jack-o'-lanterns, and a fog machine that created an eerie atmosphere in the front yard. Music pulsed from inside, and Aurora could see costumed figures dancing through the windows. She felt a surge of excitement as she walked up the driveway, her heels clicking against the pavement. Inside, the party was in full swing. At least 40 people filled Jessica's living room, kitchen, and back patio. The costumes ranged from silly to sophisticated. Aurora spotted a convincing werewolf, several zombies, a group dressed as characters from a popular television show, and one person who had clearly spent a fortune on an elaborate vampire costume complete with custom fangs and colored contact lenses. She made her way through the crowd, greeting friends and accepting compliments on her outfit. Jessica found her near the drinks table and pulled her into a hug. Jessica was dressed as a witch, with a pointed hat and flowing black dress. They chatted for a few minutes about work and mutual friends before Jessica was pulled away to greet new arrivals. Aurora poured herself a drink and wandered toward the back patio, where a fire pit provided warmth against the October chill. It was around 9:15 when Aurora first noticed him. She was standing near the fire pit, talking to a coworker about an upcoming project, when she caught sight of a figure standing at the edge of the patio. The costume was disturbing in its realism. The person was dressed as what appeared to be a serial killer or torture victim. She could not quite tell which. They wore a stained boiler suit, the kind mechanics wore, but it was splattered with what looked like dried blood. The mask was the most unsettling part. It was a pale, expressionless face, with hollow eyes and a slight smile that seemed both empty and malicious. In one hand, the figure held what appeared to be a very realistic knife, and in the other, a length of rope. Aurora felt a small chill run down her spine, but she quickly dismissed it. Halloween was about scary costumes after all. Someone had simply gone all out with their outfit. She turned her attention back to her conversation, but she could not shake the feeling that the figure was watching her. When she glanced back a few minutes later, the person was still standing in the same spot, completely motionless. As the night progressed, Aurora began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. Every time she moved to a different part of the house, the figure in the blood-stained boiler suit seemed to appear nearby. When she went inside to use the bathroom, she saw the person standing at the end of the hallway. When she returned to the kitchen for another drink, they were near the doorway. When she stepped outside for fresh air, they were at the edge of the yard, partially obscured by shadows. Aurora tried to rationalize her growing unease. Maybe it was just coincidence. The house was crowded, and it was natural that she would encounter the same people multiple times. But something felt wrong. The figure never spoke to anyone, never removed the mask, never seemed to interact with other guests at all. They just stood there, always at a distance, always watching. Around 10 o'clock, Aurora decided she had had enough. She was going to confront the person directly and find out who they were. Maybe it was someone's idea of a joke, or maybe they were just socially awkward and did not know how to join the party. She spotted the figure standing near the hallway that led to the bedrooms and made her way toward them, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. As she approached, the figure did not move. Up close, the costume was even more disturbing. The blood on the boiler suit looked far too realistic, with varying shades of red and brown that suggested different stages of drying. There was a smell too, something metallic and unpleasant that made her stomach turn. The mask was made of some kind of latex or silicone, and the eyes behind it were completely obscured. Aurora cleared her throat and tried to sound friendly despite her nervousness. She asked if they were having a good time and if they knew Jessica. The figure did not respond. They simply tilted their head slightly, as if studying her. Aurora felt her skin prickle with goosebumps. She asked again, more forcefully this time, who they were and how they knew the host. Still no response. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Then, slowly, the figure raised their hand, the one holding the knife, and pointed directly at Aurora. Not at anything behind her or beside her, at her specifically. Aurora felt her breath catch in her throat. This was not funny anymore. This was not part of any joke she understood. She turned quickly and walked back toward the main party area, her heart now pounding in earnest. She found Jessica near the kitchen and pulled her aside, trying to keep her voice calm as she explained that there was someone at the party in a disturbing costume who was acting strangely. Jessica looked confused and asked what the person looked like. Aurora described the blood-stained boiler suit and expressionless mask. Jessica's expression shifted from confusion to concern. She said she did not know anyone who had come in that costume. She had been greeting people at the door for the first hour of the party and did not remember seeing anyone dressed like that. Aurora insisted the person was there, that she had seen them multiple times throughout the night. Jessica suggested they find the person together and figure out who they were. The two women moved through the house, checking each room and asking other guests if they had seen someone matching Aurora's description. Several people said yes, they had noticed the person, but nobody seemed to know who they were. One guest mentioned that the costume had made them uncomfortable as well. Another said they had tried to talk to the person earlier, but had been completely ignored. Jessica's concern deepened. She asked her boyfriend, who was also at the party, to help search the house more thoroughly. They checked the bedrooms, the basement, even the garage. The figure in the blood-stained boiler suit was nowhere to be found. Aurora began to wonder if she had imagined the whole thing or if the person had somehow left without anyone noticing. It was nearly 10:30 when Aurora decided to leave. The fun had been drained from the evening, and she felt exhausted from the anxiety of the past hour. She said her goodbyes to Jessica and promised to text when she got home safely. As she walked to her car, which was parked on the street about half a block away, she tried to shake off the unsettled feeling that had taken hold of her. The street was quiet, with only a few porch lights illuminating the darkness. Most of the neighborhood families had finished with trick-or-treating hours ago, and the suburban area felt almost deserted. Aurora reached her car and fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly from a combination of cold and residual fear. That was when she saw movement in her peripheral vision. She turned her head sharply and felt her blood run cold. The figure in the blood-stained boiler suit was standing on the sidewalk about 20 feet away, perfectly still, watching her. Aurora's hands trembled as she finally managed to unlock her car door. She threw herself inside and immediately locked the doors, her breath coming in short gasps. The figure began to walk toward her car. Not running, just walking with slow, deliberate steps. Aurora fumbled with her keys again, trying to get them into the ignition. Her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped them on the floor. She bent down frantically to retrieve them, and when she sat back up, the figure was standing directly beside her driver's side window. Aurora screamed. She could see the mask up close now, pressed almost against the glass. The hollow eyes seemed to bore into her, and she could see that the blood on the boiler suit was not fake. It was too dark in some places, too shiny in others, with a texture that no costume shop could replicate. This was real blood, fresh blood. She finally got the key into the ignition and started the engine. The figure reached out and tried the door handle, pulling at it repeatedly. Aurora threw the car into drive and pressed the accelerator, the tires squealing as she pulled away from the curb. In her rearview mirror, she could see the figure standing in the middle of the street, watching her go. Aurora drove straight to the nearest police station, her entire body trembling. She barely managed to compose herself enough to explain what had happened to the officer at the front desk. She told them about the figure at the party, about being followed to her car, about the blood on the costume that looked too real. The officer took her statement seriously and immediately dispatched units to Jessica's address and to the street where Aurora had been parked. Police searched the area for over an hour, but found no trace of anyone matching the description. They did, however, find something that made Aurora's blood run cold all over again. On the sidewalk near where her car had been parked, they discovered a digital camera. It was an older model, the kind that used removable memory cards. The police took it as evidence and later reviewed the contents. The memory card contained hundreds of photographs, images of different people at different locations, all taken without the subject's knowledge. There were photos of women leaving work, walking to their cars, entering their homes. There were photos taken through windows at night. And there were photos from Jessica's Halloween party, dozens of them, all focused on Aurora. Pictures of her talking to friends, pictures of her getting a drink, pictures of her walking through the house. The final photos on the card had been taken outside, showing Aurora's car from various angles, with timestamps indicating they had been taken over the course of several weeks leading up to Halloween. The investigation revealed that someone had been stalking multiple Halloween events throughout the Portland area that night. Several other women at different parties reported seeing a person in a blood-stained boiler suit acting strangely. One woman claimed the person had followed her for several blocks before she managed to get inside her apartment building and lock the door. Another reported finding muddy footprints on her back porch the morning after Halloween, along with evidence that someone had tried to open her sliding glass door. Despite the evidence and multiple witness reports, the person was never identified. The costume likely came from a regular store, and the mask was a common style available at dozens of retailers. There were no fingerprints on the camera, and no DNA evidence could be recovered from the items found at the scene. The investigation eventually went cold, filed away as an unsolved case of stalking and harassment. Aurora never attended another Halloween party. The holiday that had once filled her with joy and nostalgia now only brought back the memory of that expressionless mask pressed against her car window, and the sickening realization that the blood on that costume had been real. She moved to a different neighborhood 6 months later and installed a sophisticated security system in her new home. She still sees that mask sometimes in her dreams, always watching, always silent, always just out of reach. And every Halloween, she makes sure all her doors and windows are locked well before the sun goes down. Nicholas had taken the job at Harvest Moon Farm more out of necessity than passion. He was 22 years old, between semesters at community college, and needed money to help pay for textbooks and rent. The farm ran a haunted corn maze attraction every October, and they were looking for scare actors who could work nights and weekends. The pay was decent, and Nicholas figured scaring tourists would be more entertaining than flipping burgers or stocking shelves at a retail store. The farm was located about 30 miles outside of Des Moines, Iowa, surrounded by flat agricultural land that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The corn maze itself covered nearly 15 acres and had been designed with a complex pattern of paths that could take visitors anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours to navigate, depending on their luck and sense of direction. The farm's owners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, had been running the attraction for over 20 years and took pride in creating an experience that was frightening but family-friendly. Nicholas started working at the maze in early October, and by the third week of the month, he knew every twist and turn of the paths by heart. His designated scare spot was near the middle of the maze, where the corn grew tallest and the shadows were deepest. He would hide behind strategically placed hay bales and jump out at visitors as they passed, usually accompanied by a recorded scream played through hidden speakers. It was repetitive work, but he enjoyed the genuine shrieks of surprise he could elicit from unsuspecting guests. The other actors were friendly enough. There was a college girl named Brittany who played a ghost bride, a middle-aged man named Dale who wore a scarecrow costume, and a handful of high school students who rotated through various monster costumes. They would gather before opening each night to coordinate their routines and share stories about the best scares they had achieved. By late October, they had developed a comfortable camaraderie that made the cold nights more bearable. Halloween night was always the busiest of the season. The farm stayed open until midnight, and hundreds of people purchased tickets to walk through the maze. Nicholas arrived early for his shift, pulling on his costume, a torn and bloodied farmer outfit with a hockey mask, and heading to his designated spot. The sun had already set, and the maze was illuminated only by occasional lanterns hanging from poles along the main paths. The first few hours passed normally. Groups of teenagers, families with older children, and couples on dates made their way through the maze, and Nicholas performed his scare routine dozens of times. Some people screamed and laughed. Others barely reacted. A few tried to scare him back. It was all part of the expected rhythm of the night. Around 10:30, Nicholas took his scheduled break. He removed his mask and walked toward the break area, which was located in a barn near the maze entrance. The cool October air felt good on his face after wearing the stuffy mask for hours. He grabbed a bottle of water and sat down on a hay bale, checking his phone for messages. That was when he heard it, a voice calling his name. Not his stage name or a generic shout, but his actual name, Nicholas. The voice was faint, as if coming from deep within the maze, but it was clear enough that he could distinguish the syllables. He looked around, thinking one of the other actors was playing a prank on him, but everyone was either inside the barn or stationed at their own scare spots. He stood up and walked toward the edge of the maze, listening carefully. The voice came again, slightly louder this time. Nicholas. It was a man's voice, rough and aged, with a quality that made the hair on the back of Nicholas's neck stand up. The voice sounded exactly like his grandfather, who had passed away the previous November. They had been close, and Nicholas had taken his death hard. Hearing that familiar tone, that specific cadence, sent a wave of emotion and confusion through him. Nicholas knew he should ignore it. He was supposed to be on break, and wandering into the maze alone was against the rules the Hendersons had established for safety reasons. But something compelled him forward. He stepped into the maze entrance and began following the sound of the voice. It called to him again and again, always seeming to come from just ahead, always just out of sight around the next corner. The maze felt different without the presence of visitors. The shadows seemed darker, and the rustling of the dried corn stalks in the breeze sounded almost like whispers. Nicholas had walked these paths hundreds of times over the past few weeks. But now, they felt unfamiliar, as though the maze had rearranged itself when he was not looking. He turned left at an intersection where he would normally have gone right, following the voice that continued to call his name. Nicholas. Come here, boy. I need to show you something. The words were clearer now, and Nicholas felt tears prick at his eyes. It was his grandfather's voice, without question. He remembered that exact phrasing from his childhood, when his grandfather would call him over to examine something interesting in the garage or the garden. Come here, boy. I need to show you something. He walked faster, his break time forgotten, his responsibilities as an actor forgotten. All that mattered was finding the source of that voice. He turned another corner and found himself in a section of the maze he did not recognize. That should have been impossible. He had helped set up the maze, had walked through it during the day and night, had memorized the entire layout. But this path was new. The corn seemed taller here, the stalks pressed closer together, and the ground beneath his feet felt softer, almost spongy. The voice called again, and Nicholas followed it into a small clearing that definitely had not been part of the original maze design. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, barely visible in the darkness. Nicholas's heart raced as he squinted to make out details. The figure was tall and thin, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to a different era. As Nicholas's eyes adjusted, he recognized the silhouette, the slightly stooped posture, the way the figure held his hands clasped behind his back, the flat cap his grandfather had always worn when working outdoors. Nicholas tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure turned toward him, and in the faint moonlight that filtered through the corn stalks, Nicholas could see his grandfather's face. It looked exactly as he remembered, down to the deep wrinkles around the eyes and the silver stubble on the chin. But something was wrong. The eyes were empty, dark pools that reflected no light, and the smile on the face was too wide, stretching beyond what should have been anatomically possible. The figure raised one hand and pointed toward the ground at the edge of the clearing. Nicholas followed the gesture and saw a disturbed patch of earth, as though something had recently been buried or unearthed there. The figure gestured more insistently, and Nicholas understood. He was supposed to dig there. He was supposed to find something. Terror finally broke through the spell of grief and confusion that had been guiding Nicholas's actions. This was not his grandfather. This was something else. Something using his grandfather's appearance to lure him into this impossible section of the maze. Nicholas stumbled backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The figure's smile widened impossibly further, and it took a step toward him. Nicholas turned and ran. He crashed through the cornstalks, no longer caring about staying on the paths. Dried leaves and stems scratched at his face and hands. He could hear movement behind him, something large pushing through the corn, keeping pace with his desperate flight. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, until he finally burst onto a main path he recognized. Other actors were there, and visitors too, all looking at him with concern and confusion. Brittany, the ghost bride actress, asked if he was all right. Nicholas could not answer. He bent over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath and slow his racing heart. Dale, the scarecrow, came over and put a hand on his shoulder, asking what had happened. Nicholas tried to explain, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. He talked about hearing his grandfather's voice, about following it to a clearing that should not exist, about seeing a figure that looked like his grandfather but was not. The other actors exchanged worried glances. Dale suggested Nicholas go home early, that maybe he was coming down with something or had been working too hard. Nicholas wanted to dismiss what he had seen as exhaustion or imagination, but he could not shake the image of that disturbed earth in the clearing. After his shift ended at midnight, after all the visitors had left and the other actors had gone home, Nicholas approached Mr. Henderson and told him about the experience. He expected skepticism or dismissal, but the old farmer listened carefully and then nodded slowly. Mr. Henderson said they would check the maze in the morning after there was proper light. Nicholas went home but barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the night over and over. When dawn broke, he drove back to the farm, arriving just as Mr. Henderson was preparing to walk through the maze with a handheld GPS unit that showed the maze's layout. They started at the entrance and followed the path Nicholas had taken the night before, with Nicholas trying to remember each turn he had made. But when they reached the area where he thought the clearing should be, there was nothing unusual. Just the normal maze paths, laid out exactly as they had been designed. No clearing, no disturbed earth, nothing to suggest anything out of the ordinary had occurred. Mr. Henderson looked at Nicholas with concern and suggested he take a few days off. Nicholas agreed, feeling foolish and confused. But as they were walking back toward the barn, Nicholas noticed something on the ground near the edge of the path. A flat cap, old and weathered, exactly like the one his grandfather used to wear. He picked it up with trembling hands and showed it to Mr. Henderson. The farmer examined the cap and frowned. He said it looked like it had been there for a while, buried in the dirt and only recently exposed. Nicholas's grandfather had never been to this farm, had never even visited Iowa as far as Nicholas knew. There was no logical reason for his cap to be there. Nicholas insisted they dig at that spot, and Mr. Henderson reluctantly agreed. They returned with shovels, began to excavate carefully. About 2 feet down, they found a metal lockbox, old and rusted, but still intact. Mr. Henderson used bolt cutters to break the corroded lock, and they opened the box to find its contents remarkably well preserved inside a waterproof lining. The box contained photographs, letters, and documents. As Nicholas looked through them, his hands began to shake. The photographs showed his grandfather as a young man, standing in front of this very farm with people Nicholas did not recognize. The letters were addressed to his grandfather from someone named Henderson, discussing business matters and family affairs. The documents included a deed showing that Nicholas's grandfather had once owned a portion of the land where the farm now stood. Nicholas had never known about any of this. His grandfather had never mentioned owning property in Iowa or having any connection to this area. He called his mother that afternoon and asked if she knew anything about it. After a long pause, she admitted that his grandfather had sold some land in Iowa decades ago, before Nicholas was born. It had been part of an inheritance from his own father, but he had sold it during hard financial times. She said he had always regretted the sale and had intended to tell Nicholas about the family history when he was older. But the time had never seemed right. Nicholas realized that his grandfather, in whatever form had appeared to him that night, had been trying to ensure these family heirlooms were found before the land was developed further or lost forever. The box contained photographs of relatives Nicholas had never seen, letters that revealed aspects of his family history he had never known, and documents that proved his family's connection to this land. He quit his job at the farm the next day. He could not bring himself to work in the maze anymore, not after what he had experienced. The Hendersons understood and did not press him for details. Nicholas took the lockbox and its contents home and spent weeks going through everything, learning about his grandfather's past and his family's history. He is 23 now, and he still cannot explain what happened that Halloween night in the corn maze. He does not know if it was truly his grandfather's spirit, some kind of psychic impression left on the land, or something else entirely. But he knows he heard that voice, saw that figure, and was led to that exact spot where the lockbox had been buried for decades. Sometimes, on quiet nights, he thinks he can still hear his grandfather's voice calling to him. "Come here, boy. I need to show you something." But now, instead of fear, Nicholas feels only gratitude. Whatever had been in that maze, whatever had worn his grandfather's face, had wanted him to find those family treasures. And for that, he will always be thankful, even if he never fully understands what truly happened in that impossible clearing deep in the corn. Ellie had married her husband Marcus in June of 2015, and by October, they had just settled into their first house together. It was a modest 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood in Springfield, Massachusetts. The kind of place where children rode bicycles on the sidewalks and neighbors waved to each other while mowing their lawns. The house needed some work, but it had good bones and was located on a street known for enthusiastic Halloween celebrations. Ellie loved Halloween almost as much as she loved Christmas. She had spent the weeks leading up to the holiday decorating their front porch with carved pumpkins, fake spider webs, and strings of orange lights. She and Marcus had purchased enough candy to fill 3 large bowls, determined to make a good impression on their new neighbors and the local children. This would be their first Halloween as homeowners, their first chance to be the house that kids remembered and talked about. October 31st fell on a Saturday that year, which meant trick-or-treating would be especially busy. Ellie took the day off from her job as an elementary school teacher to prepare. She set up a folding table near their front door with the candy bowls, made sure the porch lights were working properly, and even created a playlist of Halloween-themed music to play from a speaker. Marcus came home from work at 5:30, and by 6 o'clock, they were ready for the first wave of trick-or-treaters. The evening started perfectly. Families with young children began arriving just after 6, and Ellie delighted in seeing the creative costumes. There were princesses and superheroes, dinosaurs and pirates, one particularly adorable toddler dressed as a pumpkin. She and Marcus took turns answering the door, complimenting costumes and handing out generous portions of candy. The neighborhood was exactly as friendly and wholesome as they had hoped. At 8:47 in the evening, according to the timestamp Ellie would later remember checking on her phone, a child dressed as a skeleton appeared at their door. Ellie had answered, and she remembered smiling at what she initially thought was a well-crafted costume. The skeleton outfit was a black bodysuit with white bones printed on it, and the child wore a plastic skull mask that covered the entire head. The costume itself was not unusual, but something about the child felt immediately wrong. The child stood perfectly still on the porch, holding out a plastic pumpkin bucket without saying a word. Most children would say trick or treat, or at least make some sound of excitement when receiving candy. But this child remained completely silent. Ellie dropped a handful of candy into the bucket and waited for the child to leave. But they just stood there, staring at her through the empty eye sockets of the mask. Ellie asked if the child needed more candy or if they were lost, but there was no response. The child simply turned around with mechanical precision and walked down the porch steps, disappearing into the darkness of the street. Ellie felt a strange chill run through her, but she shook it off and returned to Marcus, mentioning that there had been an odd kid in a skeleton costume who had not said anything. At 9:15, the doorbell rang again. Ellie was in the kitchen refilling one of the candy bowls, so Marcus answered the door. A moment later, he called to her with confusion in his voice. When Ellie came to the door, she saw the same skeleton costume child standing on the porch, holding out the same plastic pumpkin bucket. Marcus said the child had not spoken a word, just stood there, waiting for candy. Ellie felt her unease return. She asked the child if they had already been to their house earlier, but again, there was no response. Just that silent, motionless stance, and the empty eyes of the skull mask staring at them. Marcus dropped candy into the bucket, and once again the child turned with that same mechanical precision and walked away into the darkness. Ellie and Marcus looked at each other with matching expressions of discomfort. Marcus suggested maybe the child lived nearby and was making multiple rounds to different houses. But Ellie pointed out that the child had returned to their specific house less than half an hour later. That seemed unusually quick, even for an enthusiastic trick-or-treater. At 9:42, the doorbell rang a third time. Ellie checked the peephole before opening the door, and her stomach tightened when she saw the skeleton costume. She opened the door slowly, and there stood the child, in exactly the same position, holding out the same pumpkin bucket. The costume looked identical. No dirt, no tears, no signs of having walked around the neighborhood for hours. Even the plastic bucket appeared pristine, as though the candy they had given twice before had vanished. This time, Ellie spoke more firmly, asking who the child was and where their parents were. She said they had already given candy twice and that it was not appropriate to keep coming back. The child did not respond, did not move, did not show any sign of having heard her at all. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Ellie placed a single piece of candy in the bucket, hoping that would satisfy whatever strange game this was. The child turned and walked away, and Ellie quickly closed and locked the door. Marcus suggested they turn off the porch light and stop answering the door for the night. It was getting late anyway, and the stream of trick-or-treaters had slowed to a trickle. Ellie agreed, feeling genuinely unsettled now. There was something profoundly wrong about that silent child and their repeated visits. She and Marcus cleaned up the candy bowls and settled on the couch to watch a movie, trying to shake off the strange mood the encounter had created. At 10:11, the doorbell rang again. Neither of them moved to answer it. They sat on the couch, looking at each other in the dim light of the television. The doorbell rang a second time, then a third. Then they heard knocking, slow and deliberate. Ellie whispered that they should just ignore it, that whoever it was would eventually give up and leave. But the knocking continued, growing slightly louder with each repetition. Marcus stood up and went to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain to look outside. He went pale and gestured for Ellie to come look. She joined him at the window and felt her breath catch in her throat. The skeleton costume child was standing on their porch, but this time, the child was not facing the door. The child was facing directly toward the window, toward them, as though knowing exactly where they were standing. And the child was completely motionless, arms hanging at their sides, skull mask pointed directly at them. Ellie grabbed her phone and suggested calling the police, but Marcus said he would go outside and confront whoever was doing this. It had to be some teenager playing an elaborate prank, he insisted. No actual child would behave this way. Ellie begged him not to go outside, but Marcus was determined. He unlocked the front door and stepped onto the porch. The child was gone. Marcus looked around, checking the porch, the front yard, the street. There was no sign of anyone. The neighborhood was quiet and dark, with most houses having turned off their porch lights for the night. Marcus came back inside, looking confused and slightly embarrassed. Maybe they had both been imagining things, he suggested. Maybe the stress of the new house and work was making them see patterns where there were none. At 11:32, Ellie woke up from a light doze on the couch. She had fallen asleep during the movie, and Marcus was snoring softly beside her. She was about to wake him and suggest they go upstairs to bed when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. A tapping noise coming from the direction of their bedroom on the second floor. Ellie sat up slowly, her heart beginning to race. The tapping came again, a deliberate rhythm against glass. Someone was tapping on their bedroom window, their second-floor bedroom window. She shook Marcus awake and whispered what she was hearing. They both sat frozen on the couch, listening as the tapping continued. Marcus grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and they crept upstairs together, clinging to each other. The tapping grew louder as they approached their bedroom. Marcus slowly pushed open the door and turned on the overhead light. The room was empty, but the tapping continued. It was coming from the window that overlooked their backyard. Marcus crossed to the window and pulled back the curtain in one quick motion. Ellie screamed. The skeleton costume child was there, somehow suspended at their second-floor window, pressed against the glass. The skull mask was tilted at an angle, the empty eye sockets seeming to stare directly into their bedroom. One small hand was raised, tapping against the window with a slow, methodical rhythm. Marcus shouted and stumbled backward. Ellie was already on her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. She told the dispatcher there was someone at their window, someone who could not possibly be there without a ladder. The dispatcher said police were on their way and instructed them to stay inside and away from the windows. It took the police 7 minutes to arrive, though it felt like an eternity. When they checked outside, there was no one at the window, no ladder propped against the house, no footprints in the flower beds below. The police searched the yard and the surrounding area thoroughly, but found no evidence that anyone had been there at all. One of the officers suggested they check their neighbor's security cameras, and over the next few days, Ellie and Marcus did exactly that. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. Multiple neighbors had doorbell cameras and security systems. and the footage showed the skeleton costume child appearing at various houses throughout the neighborhood that night. But the timestamps made no logical sense. The child appeared at houses on opposite ends of the street, at times only minutes apart, distances that would be impossible to cover on foot in such short intervals. More disturbing, one neighbor who lived 3 houses down recognized the costume. Mrs. Patterson was 87 years old and had lived on the street her entire life. She looked at the security footage and went pale. She told Ellie that the costume was identical, down to the exact style and design, to one worn by a child named Timothy who had gone missing on Halloween night in 1982. Timothy had been trick-or-treating on this very street when he vanished. His body was never found, and the case remained unsolved. Ellie researched the story and found old newspaper articles confirming Mrs. Patterson's account. The photographs of Timothy in his skeleton costume from before he disappeared showed the exact same outfit the child had worn to their door. Same black bodysuit, same bone pattern, same plastic skull mask. Ellie still sees the skeleton child sometimes, even years later. Just in her peripheral vision, a small figure in a bone costume standing at the edge of her yard or on the sidewalk outside her window. It never comes close, never tries to enter, just watches from a distance. She and Marcus moved to a different neighborhood in 2018, but the sightings have followed her. Every Halloween, without fail, she catches a glimpse of that silent, watching figure. She has learned to live with it, though she will never understand what it wants or why it chose her. Some mysteries, she has come to realize, are not meant to be solved. Some visitors from Halloween night never truly leave. Adam and Sadie had been dating for nearly 3 years when Halloween 2017 arrived, and they were both enthusiasts of anything that promised a good scare. They had visited haunted houses, taken ghost tours, and watched every horror movie they could find. When they discovered that Riverside Psychiatric Hospital was offering guided Halloween night tours before its scheduled demolition, they immediately purchased tickets. The hospital had been abandoned since 1994 and had a reputation for disturbing history that stretched back to the 1920s. The facility was located about 40 miles outside of Nashville, Tennessee, sitting on a sprawling property that had once housed hundreds of patients. The main building was a massive 4-story structure made of red brick, with barred windows and a clock tower that had stopped working decades ago. Smaller buildings surrounded the main structure, connected by covered walkways that had fallen into severe disrepair. The entire property was fenced off and covered with "No trespassing" signs. But the current owners had decided to offer tours as a way to generate interest in the property's dark history before it was razed. Adam and Sadie arrived at the hospital gates at 7:30 in the evening on October 31st. About 20 other people had purchased tickets for their tour time slot, and they all gathered in what used to be the main lobby while their guide introduced himself. His name was Marcus, a local historian who had researched the hospital extensively. He explained that Riverside had been notorious for its use of experimental treatments, including lobotomies, electroshock therapy, and extended isolation. Multiple patients had died under suspicious circumstances, and there had been several documented cases of abuse by staff members. The tour began in the administrative wing, where offices still contained rusted filing cabinets and scattered patient records. Marcus explained that much of the hospital's documentation had been removed when it closed, but enough remained to give visitors a sense of the bureaucratic machinery that had run the facility. From there, they moved to the patient wards, long hallways lined with small rooms that had once held beds. The paint was peeling from the walls in great sheets, and water damage had caused sections of the ceiling to collapse. Sadie stayed close to Adam as they walked through the decaying building. Despite her love of horror attractions, there was something genuinely unsettling about being inside an actual location where real suffering had occurred. This was not a fabricated haunted house with paid actors. This was a place where people had been confined against their will, subjected to treatments that would be considered torture by modern standards. The tour continued to the hydrotherapy room, where patients had been subjected to hours in ice baths as a form of calming treatment. Then they visited the electroshock therapy area, where the equipment still remained, covered in rust and dust. Marcus shared stories of specific patients, reading from his notes about men and women who had entered the hospital for minor issues and never left. Around 8:45, the group reached the west wing of the second floor. Marcus explained that this section had been sealed off in 1987 after a fire had damaged part of the structure, making it unsafe. The hospital had continued operating for another 7 years, but this entire wing had remained closed and unused. They were standing at the entrance to the sealed wing, looking down a dark hallway blocked by chains and warning signs, when Adam heard it. Chanting, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere down that forbidden hallway. He turned to Sadie and asked if she heard it too. She nodded, her eyes wide. Several other members of the tour group had also noticed the sound. Marcus frowned and said that should not be possible. The wing was structurally unsound and had been locked for decades. No one should be in there. The chanting continued, and now Adam could make out multiple voices, though he could not understand the words. It sounded like some kind of ritual or ceremony. Marcus pulled out his radio and called to the security guard who was stationed at the main entrance. He explained what they were hearing and asked if anyone had authorization to be in the West Wing. The security guard said absolutely not, and that he would call the police immediately. Marcus instructed the tour group to stay together and began leading them back toward the main entrance. But Sadie grabbed Adam's arm and pointed down a side hallway. There was light coming from under one of the doors, a flickering orange glow like candlelight. Against his better judgment, Adam moved toward the door with Sadie following. Several other members of the tour group, curiosity overcoming caution, came with them. The door was unlocked. Adam pushed it open slowly and felt his breath catch. The room beyond had clearly been used recently. Candles burned on every available surface, dozens of them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The walls themselves were covered in symbols drawn in what appeared to be ash or charcoal. The symbols were strange, a mixture of geometric patterns and crude figures that Adam did not recognize, but that made him deeply uncomfortable to look at. In the center of the room was a circle, drawn on the floor with more of the ash-like substance. Inside the circle were offerings of various kinds. Fresh flowers that looked like they had been purchased that day. Candles burning with different colored flames. A bowl filled with what might have been herbs or incense. And most disturbing, photographs. Dozens of photographs arranged in a spiral pattern, all showing people's faces. Adam stepped closer to examine them and felt Sadie grip his arm tightly. Her photograph was there. A picture of Sadie that looked like it had been taken from a distance, showing her leaving her apartment building. Adam's hands started to shake as he looked at the other photographs. He recognized several other members of their tour group. There were also photographs of people he did not recognize, but all of them appeared to be recent, taken within the past few months based on the clothing and settings. Marcus had followed them into the room and now stood frozen in the doorway. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of everything, his face pale in the candlelight. Sadie was crying softly, asking why her picture was there, asking what this meant. Adam did not have answers, but every instinct he had was screaming at him to get out of this building immediately. The chanting had stopped. The sudden silence was somehow more frightening than the sound had been. Marcus said they needed to evacuate right now, that they should all move quickly and quietly back to the main entrance. The tour group did not need to be told twice. They left the room and hurried down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the empty building. As they moved through the patient ward, Adam heard doors opening behind them. Not one or two, but many doors, the sound of rusted hinges creaking one after another. He did not look back. He kept his hand firmly clasped around Sadie's and focused on following Marcus toward the exit. The tour guide was practically running now, all pretense of a calm professional demeanor abandoned. They burst out of the main entrance into the parking lot just as police cars were pulling up, their lights flashing red and blue in the darkness. The security guard was there, looking confused and frightened. Marcus immediately began explaining what they had found, showing the photographs on his phone to the officers who approached. The police took statements from everyone in the tour group and then entered the building to investigate. They were inside for nearly an hour while Adam and Sadie sat in their car, holding each other and trying to process what they had experienced. When the officers finally emerged, they looked shaken. They confirmed that they had found the ritual room exactly as described, along with evidence of recent activity throughout the supposedly sealed West Wing. Over the following days, the investigation expanded. Police discovered that a local group had been using the abandoned hospital for months, gaining access through a damaged section of fencing that was not visible from the main gate. The group consisted of 8 members who practiced a form of folk magic that combined various regional traditions with their own invented rituals. They had been performing ceremonies in the hospital, believing the location's history of suffering gave it special power. The photographs were part of what they called cleansing rituals, meant to protect or purify the people depicted. Several members of the group were arrested, including a woman who turned out to be Sadie's estranged aunt, someone she had not seen or spoken to in over 5 years. The aunt claimed she was trying to help family members she believed were making poor life choices, including Sadie's relationship with Adam, whom she considered a bad influence. The explanation did nothing to make Sadie feel better. The idea that her aunt had been watching her, photographing her without consent, and including her in bizarre rituals was deeply violating. She obtained a restraining order and went through several months of therapy to deal with the psychological impact of the experience. The hospital was demolished in early 2018, ahead of its original schedule. The owners decided that the property's reputation had been too severely damaged by the discovery of the cult activity. Adam and Sadie never participated in another haunted attraction or ghost tour. The experience had taught them that real horror was not found in manufactured scares and paid actors, but in the actions of actual people whose beliefs led them to cross boundaries that should never be crossed. Sadie still finds strange symbols occasionally, drawn in chalk on the sidewalk near her home or scratched into the dirt of her garden. She wipes them away immediately, but they keep appearing. The restraining order prevents her aunt from coming near her, but it cannot prevent the other members of the group, most of whom received only minor legal consequences, from continuing their practices. She has moved twice since 2017, and each time the symbols eventually appear again. Whatever her aunt and that group believe they are doing, whatever ritual they think they are performing, it seems to require ongoing attention to the people they have targeted. And Sadie, whether she wants to be or not, remains one of those people. Adam stays with her, and they have installed security cameras around their current home. They check the footage regularly, looking for anyone who might be leaving the symbols or watching their property. So far, They have caught nothing definitive, just occasional figures passing by that might be neighbors, might be strangers, or might be something else entirely. They no longer celebrate Halloween. The holiday is too closely associated with that night in the abandoned hospital. With the discovery of those photographs arranged in a ritual circle, with the realization that sometimes the scariest thing about horror is that it can reach out and touch your real life in ways you never anticipated. Gavin had never been a fan of Halloween. At 29 years old, he found the holiday exhausting and juvenile, preferring to spend October 31st working rather than attending parties or handing out candy. In 2016, he was working as a nurse at St. Elizabeth Hospital in downtown Chicago, and he had volunteered to take a double shift on Halloween night. The extra money would help with rent, and it gave him a legitimate excuse to avoid his roommate's loud costume party. His shift ended at 11:30 in the evening, and Gavin was exhausted as he drove home through the streets of Chicago. The city was still alive with Halloween revelry. Groups of costumed adults stumbled between bars, and scattered trick-or-treaters accompanied by parents hurried home with their candy hauls. Gavin just wanted to get to his apartment, take a hot shower, and sleep for 10 hours straight. He lived in a mid-rise apartment building in the Lakeview neighborhood, a fairly nice area with a mix of young professionals and families. The building was 8 stories tall, with Gavin's apartment located on the 5th floor. As he pulled into the parking garage, he could hear music thumping from somewhere in the building. His roommate's party was apparently in full swing. Gavin took the elevator up, pressing the button for the 5th floor while leaning against the wall and closing his eyes briefly. The elevator dinged and the doors opened. He walked down the familiar hallway, past the decorative plant his neighbor Mrs. Chen had placed near the stairwell entrance, past the apartment where the college students lived and were always leaving their shoes in the hallway. Everything looked normal and familiar. He reached his apartment door and pulled out his keys, fumbling with them in the dim hallway lighting. The key slid into the lock, but when he turned it, nothing happened. The door was already unlocked. Gavin frowned. His roommate Derek was usually careful about locking the door, especially during parties. Maybe someone had stepped out for a cigarette and forgotten to lock it behind them. Gavin pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was dark and quiet. The music he had heard in the parking garage must have been coming from a different floor. He felt along the wall for the light switch, and that was when he noticed something was wrong. The furniture was in the wrong place. The couch that should have been directly ahead of him was gone, replaced by what looked like a dining table in the dim light from the hallway. His hand found the light switch and he flipped it on. Gavin stood frozen in the doorway, his tired brain struggling to process what he was seeing. This was not his apartment. The layout was identical. Same entrance hallway, same open-plan living area, same kitchen to the left. But everything else was different. Different furniture, different decorations on the walls, different color scheme. The apartment was decorated in earth tones and had a more feminine aesthetic than the cluttered bachelor pad he shared with Derek. Gavin took a step backward, realizing he must have gotten off the elevator on the wrong floor. But that made no sense. He had pressed the button for 5. He had walked past the familiar landmarks in the hallway. This had to be the 5th floor, unless he had somehow pressed 4 by mistake and not noticed. Before he could back out of the apartment and check the floor number, he heard voices. They were coming from the bedroom, which was located at the far end of the apartment. A man and a woman, and they were arguing. The woman's voice was high and frightened, pleading. The man's voice was angry, aggressive, escalating with each exchange. Gavin's nursing instincts kicked in. Someone might be hurt, someone might need help. But his common sense was screaming at him to leave immediately, to get out of this apartment that was not his, and call security. He stood paralyzed in the entrance, caught between the urge to help and the knowledge that he was trespassing. The argument in the bedroom grew louder. The woman was crying now, begging. Gavin heard something crash, the sound of breaking glass. The man was shouting obscenities. Gavin pulled his phone from his pocket with shaking hands and dialed 911. He whispered to the dispatcher that he had accidentally entered the wrong apartment, and there was a violent domestic dispute happening. He gave the building address, but realized with horror that he did not actually know what floor he was on. The dispatcher asked him to repeat the information, and Gavin was whispering the address again when he heard the sound that would haunt him for years. A single gunshot, impossibly loud in the enclosed space of the apartment. Then a heavy thump, like something falling. Then silence. Gavin's blood turned to ice. The phone was still against his ear, the dispatcher asking if he was still there, asking what was happening. But he could not make his mouth form words. He stared down the hallway toward the bedroom, where he could now see a strip of light under the door. A shadow moved across that strip of light, and Gavin realized the man was coming out of the bedroom. Pure survival instinct took over. Gavin looked around frantically for a place to hide. The apartment's coat closet was right beside him, its door slightly ajar. He slipped inside and pulled the door shut as quietly as possible, his heart hammering so hard he was certain it could be heard throughout the entire apartment. The dispatcher's voice was still coming from his phone, asking questions, and he pressed the phone against his chest to muffle the sound. Through the crack in the closet door, Gavin could see the man emerge from the hallway. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with a heavy build and wearing jeans and a white undershirt. His hands were shaking, and he was holding a pistol at his side. The man's face was contorted with a mix of rage and panic. He moved through the living area, and Gavin held his breath, pressed against the coats and jackets hanging in the closet. The man went to the front door, which Gavin had left wide open in his panic. He peered out into the hallway, looking left and right. Then he closed the door and locked it. He stood there for a moment, pressing his forehead against the door, his shoulders heaving as though he might be crying or hyperventilating. Then he turned around and walked back toward the bedroom. Gavin waited in the closet, counting the seconds, his lungs burning from holding his breath. He could hear the dispatcher's tiny voice still coming from his phone, and he slowly brought it back to his ear. He whispered that there had been a gunshot, that someone was hurt or dead, that the shooter was still in the apartment and he was hiding in a closet. The dispatcher told him to stay on the line, that police were already on their way, that he should stay hidden and stay quiet. Minutes crawled by. Gavin could hear movement in the apartment, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the man's footsteps moving back and forth. At one point, the man walked past the closet, so close that Gavin could have reached out and touched him through the door. He squeezed his eyes shut and prayed the man would not check the closet. After what felt like hours but was probably closer to 8 or 9 minutes, Gavin heard the most beautiful sound he had ever experienced. Sirens, multiple sirens, growing louder as they approached the building. He heard them cut off suddenly, indicating the emergency vehicles had arrived. The man in the apartment cursed, and there was more crashing sounds, things being thrown. Then came the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside and authoritative voices shouting, "Police, open the door!" The man in the apartment was yelling back, his words incoherent. Gavin pressed himself further back in the closet, terrified that the situation was about to become even more dangerous. There was a loud crash as the door was forced open. Then the sound of multiple officers rushing in, shouting commands. "Drop the weapon! Get on the ground! Hands where I can see them!" Gavin heard the man shouting something back, then more scuffling sounds. After several tense seconds, he heard an officer call out that the suspect was in custody. Only then did Gavin push open the closet door. He stumbled out with his hands raised, identifying himself to the officers who immediately pointed weapons at him, until they verified he was the person who had called 911. An officer quickly escorted him out of the apartment and into the hallway, where Gavin finally looked at the number on the door. 413. He was on the 4th floor, not the 5th. He had gotten off the elevator one floor too early and had walked to the apartment directly below his own. Other officers were rushing past him into the apartment, and he heard one of them calling for paramedics. The woman who had been shot was still alive, he learned later. The bullet had hit her in the shoulder, and she had lost consciousness from shock and blood loss. But she survived. If Gavin had not accidentally entered the wrong apartment, if he had not called 911 when he did, she likely would have bled to death while her boyfriend fled the scene. The boyfriend was charged with attempted murder and several other crimes. During the trial months later, prosecutors presented evidence that he had planned to kill his girlfriend over a suspected affair, dump her body, and flee the state. Gavin's unexpected intrusion and immediate call to police had disrupted that plan and ultimately saved the woman's life. Gavin moved to a different building 3 months after the incident. He could not bring himself to live in the same place anymore, knowing that one floor below his apartment, someone had almost been murdered while he was arriving home. He installed 3 different locks on his new apartment door and developed an obsessive habit of checking and rechecking that he was on the correct floor whenever he used an elevator. He is 32 now and has changed careers, no longer working as a nurse. The trauma of that Halloween night, combined with the stress of testifying at trial and the realization of how close he had come to being killed himself, led to burnout and anxiety that made it impossible for him to continue in healthcare. He works in medical billing now, a job that requires no direct patient contact and carries no risk of accidentally stumbling into life or death situations. He still has nightmares about hiding in that closet, about seeing the shadow of a man with a gun moving through the apartment, about hearing that single gunshot echo through rooms that were not his own. And every time he approaches his apartment door, he pauses and double-checks the number, making absolutely certain he is at the right place. Because he has learned that a simple mistake, being on the wrong floor at the wrong time, can change everything. Sometimes being in the wrong place saves a life, and sometimes it almost costs you your own. Lucy and Connor had always been close, despite the typical sibling rivalry that colored their childhood. By Halloween 2014, Lucy was 17 and Connor was 15, and they had developed the kind of bond that comes from shared loss. Their older brother Daniel had died 5 years earlier in a car accident when he was only 19. The tragedy had changed their family irrevocably, leaving a void that never quite healed. Their parents rarely talked about Daniel anymore. The grief was too raw, too immediate, even after 5 years. His bedroom remained exactly as he had left it, a shrine that nobody entered except their mother, who would sometimes sit on his bed and cry when she thought nobody was watching. Lucy and Connor had learned to carry their grief silently, supporting each other through the waves of sadness that would hit at unexpected moments. On Halloween night in 2014, their parents had been invited to a costume party at a friend's house. They asked if Lucy and Connor wanted to come along, but both teenagers declined. They were too old for trick-or-treating and not interested in adult parties. They would stay home, watch scary movies, and hand out candy to the neighborhood kids. Their parents left around 7:30, promising to be home by midnight. By 9 o'clock, the stream of trick-or-treaters had slowed to nothing. Lucy and Connor sat in the living room, scrolling through their phones and half watching a horror movie marathon on television. Connor suggested they do something more interesting, something that would make the night memorable. He had been reading about seances online and thought it might be fun to try conducting one. Lucy was skeptical but intrigued. She had always been interested in the paranormal, watching ghost hunting shows and reading about supposedly haunted locations. She knew seances were supposed to be dangerous if not done correctly. But she also thought most of the warnings were probably just theatrical nonsense, meant to add drama. Connor showed her a website with detailed instructions on how to conduct a basic seance, including the materials needed and the proper way to close the session. They gathered supplies from around the house, candles from the kitchen drawer, a small mirror from the bathroom, and personal items that had belonged to Daniel. His old baseball cap, a photograph from his high school graduation, and a watch their father had given him. They carried everything down to the basement, which was partially finished with a carpeted area that served as a rec room and a storage area filled with boxes and old furniture. Lucy arranged the candles in a circle on the basement floor, while Connor set up the mirror in the center. They placed Daniel's belongings around the mirror and sat down facing each other with the candles between them. The instructions said they should turn off all electric lights and use only candlelight. So Connor flipped the switch at the bottom of the stairs, plunging the basement into darkness except for the flickering flames. Following the website's directions, they held hands and Lucy spoke the opening words, inviting any spirits present to communicate with them. She felt silly at first, like a child playing make-believe. But she continued with the ritual. They asked if anyone was there, if anyone could hear them. For several minutes, nothing happened. The basement was silent, except for the sound of their breathing and the occasional creak of the house settling. Connor suggested they try addressing Daniel specifically. Lucy hesitated, suddenly feeling like they were crossing a line they should not cross. But Connor insisted, pointing out that they were just trying to say hello to their brother, to let him know they still thought about him. Lucy agreed, and together they called out Daniel's name, asking if he was there, if he could give them a sign. The candles went out, all of them simultaneously, as though someone had blown on them with tremendous force. Lucy and Connor sat in complete darkness, still holding hands, their grips tightening in sudden fear. Lucy tried to speak, to make a joke about a draft, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She asked Connor if he had matches to relight the candles. Before Connor could respond, they heard it. A voice, Daniel's voice, unmistakable and clear, calling their names. Lucy, Connor. The sound came from the far end of the basement, near the storage area. Lucy felt tears spring to her eyes immediately. It sounded exactly like their brother, the same tone and inflection she remembered from countless childhood interactions. Connor called out to the voice, asking if it was really Daniel. The response came quickly. "It is me. I miss you." Lucy felt her heart breaking and mending simultaneously. She wanted desperately to believe that they had somehow made contact with their deceased brother, that he was reaching out to them from wherever he had gone. But then the temperature in the basement dropped noticeably. Lucy could see her breath forming small clouds in the darkness, illuminated by the faint light that filtered down from the upstairs hallway. The voice called their names again, but this time something was different. The tone was slightly off, the cadence not quite right. "It is me. I miss you." The exact same words, repeated identically. Connor whispered that something felt wrong. Lucy agreed, her earlier excitement curdling into unease. The voice called again, and this time they could hear that it was not quite Daniel's voice. It was close, nearly perfect, but there was a hollowness to it, like an echo of an echo. And it was getting closer, moving through the storage area toward them. Lucy fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight feature. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the basement in stark white light. There was nothing there. No figure, no form, nothing to explain the voice they had both clearly heard. But the temperature continued to drop, and now they could hear other sounds. Movement in the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. Objects shifting, boxes scraping against the concrete floor. Connor tried to remember the closing ritual from the website. They needed to formally end the seance and dismiss whatever presence they had invited. Lucy could not remember the exact words, and Connor's hands were shaking too badly to pull up the website on his phone. They fumbled through what they remembered, speaking over each other in their panic. The voice spoke again, but this time it no longer sounded anything like Daniel. It was deeper, rougher, inhuman. The words were incomprehensible, a string of sounds that hurt to hear, that made Lucy's head throb and her stomach turn. Connor grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the stairs. They ran up together, stumbling in their haste, and Connor slammed the basement door behind them. They stood in the kitchen, breathing hard, staring at the closed basement door. From the other side, they could hear sounds. Crashing, banging, things being thrown or broken. Lucy remembered the website's warning about properly closing a seance, about the importance of dismissing any entities that might come through. They had invited something, and they had not sent it away. Connor found the website again on his phone and read the closing ritual out loud, both of them standing at the basement door and speaking the words together. They commanded any spirits present to leave, to return to where they came from, to cause no harm and have no power in this place. As they spoke, the sounds from the basement grew louder, more violent, as though whatever was down there was angry at being dismissed. Then, abruptly, everything went silent. The temperature in the house returned to normal. The feeling of oppressive wrongness that had filled the air dissipated. Lucy and Connor stood at the door for several more minutes, listening, but there were no more sounds from below. When their parents came home shortly before midnight, they found Lucy and Connor sitting in the living room with all the lights on, looking shaken and pale. They asked what was wrong, but neither teenager could bring themselves to explain. They just said they had watched a particularly scary movie and were feeling jumpy. The next morning, Lucy volunteered to go down to the basement first to see what damage had been done. She found the candles scattered across the floor, the mirror shattered into pieces, and Daniel's belongings thrown in different directions. But most disturbing were the marks on the walls. Long scratches, like fingernails or claws, had been dragged across the painted drywall, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. Their parents never found out the truth about what happened that Halloween night. Lucy and Connor cleaned up the basement together, painted over the scratch marks, and threw away the broken mirror. They told their parents a story about knocking over some boxes while looking for Halloween decorations and accidentally breaking an old mirror. Connor is 20 now and still refuses to talk about that night. He avoids discussing Daniel entirely, shutting down any conversation that might lead to reminiscing about their older brother. Lucy suspects he is afraid that speaking about it will somehow invite that presence back into their lives. Lucy is 22 now and has developed an obsessive interest in paranormal protection. Her apartment is filled with religious symbols from various traditions, salt lines at every threshold, and iron nails hidden above the doorways. She has read dozens of books about spiritual protection and cleansing rituals. She knows her friends think she has become strange and overly superstitious. But she does not care, because Lucy still sees the shadows. Sometimes, in her peripheral vision, she catches glimpses of a figure that resembles her brother. But when she turns to look directly, there is nothing there. Just an empty space where something had been standing a moment before. The figure never approaches, never tries to interact, just watches from corners and doorways. She has tried cleansing rituals, blessings, and prayers, but nothing makes the shadow go away permanently. It always comes back, always watching, always wearing her dead brother's face. And deep down, Lucy knows it will never stop. She and Connor opened a door that Halloween night, and even though they closed it, something had already come through. Something that had been waiting for an invitation, for a chance to cross over, for two grieving siblings foolish enough to call out to the darkness and expect only love to answer. The seance was supposed to bring them closure, a chance to say goodbye to the brother they had lost. Instead, it brought them something else entirely. Something that pretends to be Daniel when the lights go out, something that calls their names in a voice that is almost right, but never quite perfect. And that something is still here, still watching, still waiting for another chance to be invited back in. Isla, Henry, and Amelia had been friends since their freshman year at Northern Michigan University, and by October 2018, they were seniors looking to make the most of their final year together. All three were 21 years old and had developed a tradition of seeking out the most extreme Halloween attractions they could find each year. They had visited haunted houses, terror trails, and zombie experiences across the state, always looking for the next thrill that would push their limits. When they heard about Blackwood Farm's haunted hayride, advertised as Michigan's most intense Halloween experience, they knew they had to go. The farm was located about 90 miles from campus, deep in rural woodland outside of Traverse City. The attraction's website warned that it was not for the faint of heart, that actors were allowed to touch guests, and that participants would need to sign liability waivers. The promise of genuine fear was exactly what Isla and her friends were seeking. They drove to the farm on Halloween night, arriving just after dark. The property was impressive in its commitment to atmosphere. A dirt road led through dense forest to a large clearing where the main farmhouse stood, illuminated by orange and purple lights. Dozens of carved pumpkins lined the pathways, and fog machines created an eerie mist that hung low over the ground. Music with discordant sounds and screams played from hidden speakers, and costumed actors roamed the grounds, staying in character as they interacted with arriving guests. The three friends purchased their tickets at a booth decorated to look like a decrepit ticket office from a horror movie. The attendant, wearing gruesome makeup that made him look like a corpse, handed them clipboards with waivers to sign. Isla skimmed the document quickly. It was standard liability language about assuming risk of injury, acknowledging that actors might touch them or use props in close proximity, and agreeing not to touch or strike any actors even if frightened. She signed without hesitation, as did Henry and Amelia. They were assigned to the 9:30 hayride and joined a group of about 15 other people waiting near the boarding area. The wagon itself was an old-fashioned flatbed trailer piled with hay bales arranged as seats, pulled by a restored antique tractor. The driver wore a burlap mask and did not speak as guests climbed aboard. Isla sat between Henry and Amelia on a hay bale near the middle of the wagon, feeling her anticipation build as the tractor's engine roared to life. The hayride began by taking them deeper into the woods surrounding the farm. The trail was narrow, with trees pressing close on both sides. Every few minutes, the wagon would stop and costumed actors would emerge from the darkness, screaming and lunging at the guests. There were zombies crawling out of shallow graves, chainsaw-wielding maniacs who revved their modified chainsaws with the chains removed, and creatures wearing elaborate masks and costumes. About 20 minutes into the ride, they entered a clearing that had been set up as a torture chamber scene. There were props scattered around, a mock guillotine, wooden racks meant to look like medieval torture devices, and hanging cages that swayed in the breeze. Several actors dressed as executioners and torturers were staged throughout the area, performing their roles with commitment to the gruesome theme. As the wagon slowed to a stop, one of the actors approached Isla's side of the hayride. He was wearing a blood-stained leather apron and a hood that obscured his face. He pointed directly at Isla and gestured for her to come with him. This was apparently part of the show, pulling guests off the wagon to participate in staged scenes. Isla hesitated for only a moment before standing up, determined to play along and get the full experience. The actor took her hand and helped her down from the wagon, leading her toward one of the torture prop areas. Henry and Amelia called out encouragement, laughing at the spectacle. The other guests on the wagon watched with interest, some recording with their phones. Isla let herself be positioned near one of the wooden racks, expecting the actor to perform some rehearsed routine while the wagon watched. But as the actor's grip tightened on her wrist, Isla felt the first real spike of alarm. He was holding her too hard, his fingers digging into her skin in a way that hurt. She tried to pull back slightly, but his grip only strengthened. He leaned close to her ear and whispered something that made her blood run cold. The words were not part of any scripted performance. They were genuine threats, crude and disturbing, spoken in a tone that carried real menace. Isla tried to laugh it off, thinking perhaps he was just really committed to his role. But when she looked into his eyes through the holes in his hood, she saw something that did not belong in any haunted attraction. There was genuine malice there, a predatory hunger that had nothing to do with entertainment. She pulled harder against his grip and called out to her friends, trying to keep her voice light, but letting some of her genuine fear show through. Henry noticed first that something was wrong. He stood up on the wagon, calling out to Isla and asking if she was okay. The actor holding Isla responded by pulling something from his pocket, a zip tie, the kind used for securing cables or restraining hands. He moved to fasten it around Isla's wrist with practiced efficiency. And that was when Isla truly panicked. She screamed, not the performative scream of someone enjoying a haunted attraction, but a genuine cry for help. She tried to wrench her arm away, but the actor was stronger than her and had already gotten one end of the zip tie secured. Henry jumped off the wagon without hesitation, with Amelia right behind him. Other guests began to realize something was genuinely wrong, that this was not part of the show. Henry tackled the actor from the side, and both men went down in a tangle of limbs. Amelia rushed to Isla, trying to help her get the zip tie off her wrist. The other actors who had been performing in the scene stood frozen, clearly confused about what was happening. The wagon driver finally reacted, pulling out a radio and calling for security. Within seconds, the clearing descended into chaos. The actor Henry had tackled was fighting back viciously, punching and clawing. Other hayride staff came running from different directions, trying to assess the situation. Some of them moved to restrain the actor who had grabbed Isla, while others checked on Henry, who had a bleeding lip and scratches on his face. Isla was shaking violently, her wrist marked with deep red impressions from where the actor had gripped her. Amelia kept her arm around Isla's shoulders, talking to her in soothing tones while simultaneously shouting at the farm staff, demanding to know what kind of operation they were running. Security personnel arrived quickly. 2 large men wearing reflective vests and carrying flashlights and radios. It took several minutes to sort out what had happened. The farm's manager arrived, a woman in her 50s who looked genuinely horrified as she examined the zip tie still partially attached to Isla's wrist. She asked the security team to identify the actor. And that was when the truly disturbing truth emerged. None of the farm's actual employees recognized the man. He was not on their staff roster. He was not wearing one of their official costumes. He was someone who had infiltrated the attraction and was posing as an actor. The police were called immediately. While waiting for them to arrive, the farm staff searched the man and found items that made everyone present feel sick with fear and disgust. He had rope in his pockets, along with duct tape, a knife, and several more zip ties. He had been carrying everything he would need to abduct someone, hidden among props and costumes that would make such items seem like part of the show. Isla was taken to the hospital as a precaution. She had bruising on her wrist and some minor scrapes from where she had struggled. But the physical injuries were minor compared to the psychological impact. Henry received treatment for his split lip and the scratches on his face. Amelia stayed with both of them, canceling their planned Halloween night activities and instead sitting in the emergency room waiting area while they gave statements to police. The investigation that followed revealed disturbing information. The man who had grabbed Isla was 34 years old and had a criminal history that included assault and stalking charges. He had been targeting Halloween attractions across northern Michigan for the past 3 weeks, posing as staff or volunteers at various haunted houses and hayrides. He would blend in with the legitimate actors, using the chaotic atmosphere and expected scares as cover while he selected potential victims. Police discovered that he had been at Blackwood Farm for 3 nights, wearing different costumes and inserting himself into various scenes. The farm's management had assumed he was a volunteer from one of their regular actor pools or a friend of another staff member. Nobody had thought to verify his identity or check if he had actually gone through their hiring and training process. The nature of Halloween attractions, with their temporary seasonal staff and constantly rotating cast of actors, had made it easy for him to slip through the cracks. Most chilling was the discovery of what investigators found in his vehicle, which was parked in a remote section of the farm's lot. He had prepared a space in his van with restraints, supplies, and tools that suggested he had been planning an abduction for some time. The Halloween season, with its crowds and chaos and socially acceptable costumes involving masks and weapons, provided perfect cover for his intentions. Isla, Henry, and Amelia all attended therapy sessions following the incident. The experience had fundamentally changed how they viewed Halloween and entertainment in general. What had started as a fun tradition among friends seeking thrills had become a traumatic encounter with genuine evil hiding in plain sight. Blackwood Farm shut down permanently within weeks of the incident. The negative publicity and the lawsuit filed by Isla's family made continuing operations impossible. The farm's owners claimed they had done everything they could to ensure safety, but the investigation revealed numerous lapses in their security and staff verification processes. Isla is 24 now and has not celebrated Halloween since 2018. The holiday is too closely associated with that night, with the feeling of being grabbed and restrained, with the realization that the person holding her wanted to hurt her in ways she still cannot fully process. She has PTSD and takes medication for anxiety. Loud noises make her jump, and she cannot tolerate being touched unexpectedly, even by friends. Henry carries guilt about not reacting faster, even though everyone, including Isla herself, tells him he likely saved her life. He works out obsessively now, as though making himself stronger retroactively will change what happened. Amelia has become an advocate for better safety regulations at Halloween attractions, testifying before state legislative committees about the need for mandatory background checks and stricter security protocols. The man who attacked Isla received a lengthy prison sentence on multiple charges. Evidence linked him to attempted abductions at 3 other Halloween events, all of which had been dismissed or unreported because victims thought they were overreacting to what seemed like aggressive but technically acceptable haunted attraction behavior. The trial revealed that he had been planning and perfecting his method for years, learning how to blend into horror attractions and use their inherent chaos as camouflage for his predatory actions. Ela still has nightmares about that clearing in the woods, about the feeling of zip ties around her wrist and hands gripping too tight. She dreams about what would have happened if Henry had not jumped off the wagon, if Amelia had not been there to help, if even one small thing had gone differently. In her worst moments, she thinks about how close she came to disappearing into the darkness beyond the hayride trail, to becoming another missing person statistic associated with Halloween night. She knows now that the scariest monsters are not the ones wearing makeup and costumes, performing for crowds and collecting paychecks. The scariest monsters are the ones who hide among them, who use our expectations of theatrical fear to mask their genuine malice, who wait for the perfect moment when screaming is expected and violence is part of the show. Those monsters are real, and they are patient, and they are always watching for their opportunity. Isla learned that lesson on Halloween 2018, and it is a lesson she will carry with her for the rest of her life.